The rope was coarse against Jedediah's neck, a final scratchy kiss from a world that had only ever offered him stones. Below the dust of redemption, Gulch swirled in the unforgiving sun, stirred by the boots of the townsfolk gathered to watch him die. He was a mountain man, a ghost from the high peaks brought low by a gnawing hunger that had made him reckless. His crime, a single loaf of bread. His sentence, the gallows. Sheriff Thorne's voice boomed a self-righteous verdict sealing his fate. Jedediah closed his eyes, the image of a warm hearth, his last defiant comfort. Then a voice clear and steady cut through the silence. "Stop, release that man." Every head turned. There, standing with a strength that defied her swollen belly, was the widow Abigail Miller. "By the laws of this territory," she declared, her voice ringing with unbelievable conviction, "you cannot hang my husband." The sun was a merciless hammer over Redemption Gulch, beating down on the parched earth and the raw timber of the gallows. It was a new structure, a point of civic pride for Sheriff Clayton Thorne, who believed swift justice was the only thing that kept the savagery of the frontier at bay. Today, its victim was Jedediah Stone. Jedediah didn't look like much. He was a scarecrow of a man, his frame whittled down by a winter that had stolen everything from him. His buckskins were worn to the texture of soft leather, stained with the memory of pine sap and animal blood, but now they hung on him like a shroud. His beard was a tangled thicket of black and grey, and his eyes, the colour of a stormy sky, held a deep, hollowed-out weariness that went beyond simple hunger. It had been 3 days since the bear. It had torn through his winter camp like a dark cyclone, destroying his lean-to, scattering his meagre supplies, and leaving his cache of cured meats and pelts ruined. He had survived, but just barely limping his way down from the granite peaks, with nothing but the knife on his belt and an ache in his belly that felt like a living creature clawing at his insides. When he stumbled into Redemption Gulch, the smell of baking bread from Mrs. Gable's bakery was a form of exquisite torture. He hadn't meant to steal. In his life, he had faced down wolves' blizzards and the profound loneliness of the high country, and he had never been a thief. But the hunger was a different kind of beast. It clouded his judgment, shortened his breath, and made his hands tremble with a desperate need. He saw a loaf cooling on an outdoor rack, its golden crust seeming to glow. In a moment of pure, unthinking instinct, he snatched it. He didn't get 10 feet. A hand clamped down on his shoulder, and he was spun around to face the portly, red-faced baker, Samuel Gable. The man's shouts brought Sheriff Thorne running. Thorne was a man carved from the same hard rock as the surrounding mountains, but without any of their silent majesty. He was broad, thick-necked, with a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl of grim satisfaction. He saw the world in black and white, law-abiders and lawbreakers. A starving mountain man stealing bread was in his eyes, no different from a cold-blooded killer. The law was the law. Vagrancy and theft, Thorne had declared, his voice echoing in the small sheriff's office. In Redemption Gulch, that earns you a dance at the end of a rope. Sets an example. And so here Jedediah stood the noose, a rough collar around his neck. He could feel the splinters in the wood of the platform beneath his bare feet. He looked out at the crowd. He saw no sympathy, only a grim curiosity. These were hard people in a hard land, and they had little pity to spare for a stranger who broke their rules. He saw Samuel Gable looking uncomfortable but resolute. He saw Bertha May Higgins, the town's foremost gossip, fanning herself and whispering to her neighbor. And he saw Sheriff Thorne, standing with his hand on his Colt, a monument to his own inflexible justice. Jedediah thought of the freedom of the mountains, the crisp air, the silence broken only by the cry of an eagle. It seemed a lifetime away. He had lived a life of solitude, of self-reliance, and it was to end here in a dusty street for the crime of being hungry. He closed his eyes, a strange sense of peace settling over him. He had fought his fight. The world had won. Does the condemned have any last words? Thorn's voice was a formality devoid of any genuine interest. Jedediah opened his eyes, his gaze sweeping over the crowd one last time. He said nothing. Words were a currency he had rarely used and had no need for now. His silence was his final statement. Thorn nodded to the deputy, a young man named Elias with nervous eyes. Then let us proceed. May God have mercy on your soul. Elias reached for the lever. The collective breath of the crowd was a low hiss. The wood groaned in anticipation. Stop! The word was not a scream, but a command. It was sharp, clear, and utterly unexpected. The sound sliced through the heavy silence, and every single person, including Sheriff Thorn and the deputy, turned toward its source. Pushing her way gently through the front of the crowd was Abigail Rose Miller. She was known to everyone in town. Her husband Thomas had died just 6 months prior in a tragic accident, a runaway wagon on their farm. She was now alone, and her pregnancy was beginning to show a gentle swell beneath her simple calico dress. Her face was usually pale and drawn with grief, but today her cheeks were flushed with color, and her blue eyes, though filled with a terrifying resolve, held no trace of fear. She walked directly to the base of the gallows, her gaze fixed on the sheriff. Thorn's scowl deepened. Mrs. Miller, this is official town business. Step back. I will not, she said, her voice trembling only slightly. You are about to execute an innocent man. A murmur went through the crowd. Bertha May Higgins scoffed audibly. Innocent. We all saw him take the bread, Abigail. The man's a common thief. Abigail ignored her. Her focus was entirely on Thorn. He is not a thief, she said, raising her chin. A man cannot be charged with stealing what is already his. Thorn took a step forward, his hand dropping from his gun to rest on his hip in a gesture of paternalistic impatience. What nonsense are you talking, woman? Go home. The heat is affecting your senses. My senses are perfectly clear, Sheriff. Abigail replied, her voice gaining strength. That man, she said, pointing a resolute finger up at Jedediah, who stared down at her in stunned disbelief, is my husband. He was coming home to me. The bread was for our table. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so profound that the buzz of a fly near the gallows sounded like a roar. Husband Abigail Miller's husband was dead and buried. The woman had clearly lost her mind to grief. Thorn was the first to recover a low, dangerous laugh, rumbling in his chest. Your husband Abigail, your husband Thomas is in the churchyard cemetery. Have you forgotten? I haven't forgotten my first husband, Sheriff. She said her words precise and deliberate. This man is my second. We were married by a traveling preacher 2 months ago. His name is Jedediah Miller. She looked up at Jedediah then, and for the first time their eyes met. In her gaze he saw a desperate plea, a silent message that he could not comprehend, but felt compelled to heed. He was a man on the brink of death being offered a lifeline from the most unbelievable source imaginable. He was Jedediah Stone, a man with no one, and this pregnant widow was claiming him as her own in front of the entire town. Sheriff Thorn stared, his face a mask of purple fury and disbelief. He looked from Abigail's defiant face to Jedediah's bewildered one. The law was the law, but this was a complication he had not foreseen. The town of Redemption Gulch held its breath, waiting to see what would happen when a widow's unbelievable lie met the unyielding force of the sheriff's justice. The rope around Jedediah's neck suddenly felt less like a certainty and more like a question. Sheriff Thorne's mind, usually a straightforward instrument of order, struggled to process the scene. Abigail Miller, a woman known for her quiet demeanor and deep mourning, was standing before the entire town, fabricating a story so outlandish it bordered on madness. "Married!" Thorne sputtered, his voice dripping with incredulity. "You expect us to believe you married this mountain tramp, and you failed to mention it to anyone. It was a private matter. Sheriff." Abigail said, her hands clasped before her, a small gesture of defense. "My grief for Thomas was still fresh. We saw no need to make a public spectacle of it." "A private matter," Bertha May Higgins screeched from the crowd. "The woman's gone mad. She's trying to save a common criminal." The crowd began to murmur its agreement. The tide of their opinion easily swayed. They were ready for a hanging, a grim but simple piece of frontier entertainment and justice. This interruption was unwelcome confusing. Jedediah, still on the gallows, remained silent. His mind was a whirlwind. Who was this woman? Why was she doing this? He watched her, this fragile-looking figure, standing against the full authority of the town. He saw the terror in the slight tremor of her hands, but he also saw a core of steel in her posture, in the unwavering lock of her jaw. She was risking everything, her reputation, her safety for him, a complete stranger. A flicker of an emotion he hadn't felt in years, a protective instinct surged through him, and he instinctively played his part. He softened his expression, trying to look less like a wild man from the mountains and more like a husband wrongfully accused. Thorne, regaining his composure, decided to call her bluff. "All right, Mrs. Miller. If this man is indeed your husband, then you are responsible for him. There is an old territorial statute, rarely used, that allows a reputable citizen to claim kinship for a petty criminal to take them into their custody and vouch for their character. But it requires that you pay restitution for the crime." He smirked, confident he had her trapped. "The cost of the stolen bread is 2 bits. The cost for the trouble he's caused the town. I'll set the fine at $20. Payable immediately." $20 was a fortune. It was more than most folks in Redemption Gulch saw in a month. For a struggling widow with a farm to run and a baby on the way, it was an impossible sum. A cruel, triumphant smile played on Thorne's lips. The show would go on after all. The crowd waited, expecting Abigail to falter, to admit defeat. Instead, without a moment's hesitation, she reached into the small reticule that hung from her wrist. Her fingers fumbled for a moment before she pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. With steady hands, she untied the drawstring and poured the contents into her palm. There were a few coins, and nestled among them was a single gleaming $20 gold eagle. It was a coin she had saved, the last of the emergency money Thomas had hidden away. It was meant for a doctor when her time came, or for seed in the spring. It was her future. She walked directly up to Sheriff Thorne and slapped the coin into his outstretched hand. The metallic clink was deafening in the charged silence. $20 for the fine, she said, her voice clear and strong. She then turned to Samuel Gable the baker. "And I believe I owe you for my husband's bread." She placed 2 cents in his hand. Thorne stared at the gold coin as if it had burned him. He had been so certain. The entire town was stunned into muteness. This wasn't the act of a grief-stricken, hysterical woman. This was a calculated move paid for in hard currency. The sheriff was cornered by his own law. He had invoked the statute, and she had met its terms. To proceed with the hanging now would be a clear abuse of his power, and even in a town like Redemption Gulch, there were limits. His face darkened with fury, the veins on his neck standing out. He was being made a fool of by a pregnant widow. "Cut him down," he snarled at his deputy Elias. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Elias, looking relieved, hurried to obey. He used a knife to saw through the thick rope, and Jedediah stumbled forward free. The severed noose fell to the platform with a soft thud. He rubbed his neck, the raw, chafed skin a stark reminder of how close he had come to the end. He descended the gallows steps on shaky legs, his eyes never leaving Abigail. She met his gaze, and in that look a silent contract was passed. There were no words of thanks, no explanations. She simply gave a curt nod as if to say, "Follow me. The performance is not over." She turned and began to walk away from the gallows, her back straight, her head held high. She did not look back to see if he was following. She simply trusted that he would. Jedediah, after a moment's hesitation, fell into step behind her. The crowd parted for them, a sea of bewildered and suspicious faces. The whispers followed them like a swarm of angry bees. "Scandalous! What's she thinking? That man looks more like a wolf than a husband. Waterhor." Bertha May Higgins watched them go, with eyes narrowed in righteous indignation, already composing the story she would tell for weeks to come. Sheriff Thorne remained by the gallows, clenching the gold coin in his fist. He watched the strange pair, the gentle widow and the ragged mountain man, walk down the main street and disappear toward the road that led to the old Miller farm. This was not over. He felt it in his bones. He had been publicly thwarted, and Clayton Thorne was not a man who tolerated such humiliation. He would find out the truth of this arrangement, and when he did, he would see Jedediah Stone swing from that gallows, and he would make Abigail Miller pay for her audacious, inexplicable lie. The walk to the Miller farm was a mile of silent tension. The dust of the main road gave way to a rutted track flanked by dry fields. Jedediah walked a few paces behind Abigail, his mind reeling. The sun was still hot, but the world felt entirely new, as if he had been reborn into a life he didn't understand. He studied the woman ahead of him. She carried herself with a weary grace, the weight of her pregnancy and her predicament evident in the slump of her shoulders, which she continually tried to straighten. They arrived at a small, whitewashed farmhouse. It was a simple, sturdy-looking place, but signs of neglect were everywhere. The porch steps sagged, paint was peeling from the window frames, and the fields that should have been prepared for late-season planting were overgrown with weeds. A lone cow looked up at them from a small fenced-in pasture with mournful eyes. This was the home of a person struggling to hold on. Abigail led him not to the front door, but around back to a small detached structure that served as a barn and workshop. The air inside was cool and smelled of hay dust and old iron. She finally turned to face him, the facade of calm resolve crumbling away. Her face was pale, and she leaned against a support beam as if her legs could no longer hold her. "In the loft," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "There's a bedroll and some old blankets. You can stay there." Jedediah found his voice a rough, gravelly sound from disuse. "Why?" It was the only question that mattered. Abigail looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to gauge whether her gamble had been placed on a man of honor or a true villain. "I don't know," she admitted, her honesty raw and painful. "I saw the sheriff so proud of his new gallows. I saw you and you weren't begging. You weren't crying. You just stood there ready to meet your end. My Thomas, he used to say that you could judge a man by how he faces the inevitable." She took a shaky breath. "And I cannot run this farm alone. I can't plough, I can't mend the fences, I can't bring in the harvest. I'm going to lose it all before this baby is even born. I saw you, and I saw a man with strong hands. I saw a desperate chance. So this is a bargain, Jedediah stated, his voice flat. Yes, she said, meeting his gaze directly. This is a bargain. I saved your life. In return, you will work this farm. You will help me hold on to it. You will be respectful. You will be sober. You will act the part of my husband in town, and you will sleep in this barn. When the spring comes, or when I am safely delivered of my child and can manage on my own, you will be free to leave. You can disappear back into whatever mountain you came from. He considered her words. She was offering him a new life, albeit a temporary and borrowed one. Food, shelter, a purpose beyond mere survival. It was more than he'd had in a very long time. And if I refuse, he asked, testing the boundaries of their strange agreement. Abigail's expression hardened. If you refuse or if you cause me any trouble, I will walk straight back to Sheriff Thorne and tell him I made a terrible mistake. I will tell him my grief confused me, and that you are a stranger who took advantage of a poor widow. They will hunt you down, and this time there will be no one to stop them from hanging you. There it was. The terms were laid bare. It was a partnership born of pure desperation, a fragile alliance against a world that was trying to crush them both. Jedediah looked from her tired, determined face to his own calloused hands. He had lived by his own rules for so long. Now his life was tied to this woman and her unborn child. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. I understand the bargain, Mrs. Miller. My name is Abigail, she corrected him quietly. And if we are to convince a town full of skeptics, you had better start using it. The first days on the Miller farm were a silent negotiation. Jedediah and Abigail circled each other like wary animals, bound by a shared secret, but separated by a chasm of experience. Jedediah, accustomed to the vast, unpeopled silence of the wilderness, found the quiet of the farm to be of a different sort. It was a heavy, expectant silence, filled with the ghosts of what used to be, and the anxieties of what was to come. He slept in the loft of the barn, a space that offered him a strange comfort. The scent of hay and old wood was familiar, and the rough wool of the blankets was a luxury after months of sleeping on pine needles and hard earth. From the small loft window he could see the house, its windows dark and empty at night, save for the single lamp Abigail kept lit in the kitchen until late. He watched her shadow move back and forth, a lonely silhouette against the glass, and felt a protective stirring he didn't fully understand. His first priority was his own recovery. Abigail left meals for him on a stump between the house and the barn, simple, nourishing fare of cornbread beans, and occasionally a piece of salted pork. He ate with the slow, deliberate pace of a man relearning the simple pleasure of a full stomach. The gnawing ache in his gut subsided, replaced by a returning strength that flowed back into his limbs like a warm tide. As his strength returned, so did his purpose. He was a man of action, not words, and he saw work everywhere he looked. The farm was Thomas Miller's legacy, and it was crumbling. The pasture fence was a study in decay, with sections of it held up by nothing more than habit. The woodpile was dwindling, a worrying sight, with the chill of autumn already creeping into the night air. The well pump had a persistent squeak that spoke of rust and imminent failure. He began without being asked. He rose before the sun, the mountain man's internal clock still set to the first hint of dawn. He started with the fence, using an old axe, and saw he found in the barn he ventured to the wooded edge of the property and began felling dead trees. He was a master of the axe. His swings were economical and powerful, each one landing with a satisfying thunk that echoed in the crisp morning air. Abigail watched him from the kitchen window as she kneaded dough for their daily bread. She saw the fluid, efficient way he moved the innate knowledge in his hands as he split the logs into perfect fence posts. He worked with a relentless, steady rhythm, never rushing, never stopping, until the sun was high in Thesky. He was not the savage vagrant Sheriff Thorne had painted him to be. He was a craftsman, a survivor. There was a deep, quiet competence about him that was both reassuring and intimidating. They rarely spoke. Their communication was a language of deeds. He would leave a neatly stacked cord of firewood by her back door. She would leave him a pail of fresh, cool water from the well. He repaired the squeaking well pump with a bit of grease and a well-placed shim. She mended a tear in his buckskin shirt, leaving it folded on the stump where his dinner usually sat. One afternoon, Jedediah was examining the broken axle of the wagon that had reportedly killed Thomas Miller. It lay near the barn, a sad, forgotten relic. The official story was that a wheel had hit a rock, the axle snapped, and the wagon loaded with timber had overturned on him. But as Jedediah ran his hand along the splintered wood of the axle, something felt wrong. He had spent his life reading the language of the wilderness, a broken twig, a displaced stone, the track of an animal. He knew how wood behaved under stress. This break wasn't clean, nor was it the jagged fibrous tear of a sudden snap. Near the center of the fracture, he found a deep V-shaped notch. It was old and weathered, but its lines were too deliberate, too precise to be accidental. It looked as if the axle had been scored, weakened intentionally, waiting for the right amount of weight and the right bump in the road to give way. It was a subtle flaw, one that an ordinary farmer might overlook, and one that a sheriff in a hurry to close a case would certainly never notice. He looked up from the axle, his stormy eyes scanning the property line. He saw the fields, the distant line of trees, the road leading back to town. A simple farm accident was one thing. A carefully engineered failure was another entirely. It was murder. That evening, as Abigail brought out his dinner, he broke their usual silence. "Mrs. Miller." "Abigail." He began, his voice raspy. She stopped, surprised. "Yes." He gestured toward the broken wagon. "Your husband, Thomas. Was he a good carpenter?" Abigail frowned, a shadow of pain crossing her features at the mention of her late husband. "He was. He built most of the furniture in our house. Why do you ask? Would he have used a piece of wood for an axle if it was flawed?" Jedediah asked, his gaze intense. She shook her head. "Never. He was the most careful man I ever knew. Meticulous. He checked everything twice." Jedediah nodded slowly, his suspicions solidifying into a grim certainty. He didn't share his discovery of the notch. Not yet. It was a dangerous piece of knowledge. Accusing someone of murder in a town run by a man like Thorne was a death sentence in itself, especially for an outsider like him. For now, it was a secret he would keep another layer to the unspoken contract between them. He now understood that his debt to Abigail was not just for saving his life from the gallows. He was entangled in the deeper, darker story of this farm, of the man who had died here. His purpose was no longer just to mend fences and chop wood. It was to protect this woman and her unborn child from a threat she didn't even know existed. That night, as he lay in the hayloft, the image of the scored axle was burned into his mind. He was a mountain man, used to fighting the clear and present dangers of nature. But this was different. This was the hidden malice of men, a poison that seeped into the very soil of this place. He had been claimed by a widow to save his own life, but he was beginning to suspect that it was he who would have to save hers. The bargain had shifted its terms, rewritten by a secret buried in a piece of broken wood. The fragile piece of the Miller farm was an isolated bubble in the hostile territory of Redemption Gulch. While Jedediah and Abigail were forging their silent working relationship, the town was a hotbed of gossip and suspicion, fanned into a raging fire by Bertha May Higgins, and stoked by the simmering fury of Sheriff Thorne. Abigail's lie had become the most scandalous topic the town had seen in years. It was dissected over poker games in the saloon, whispered over flour sacks in the general store, and debated over sewing circles in prim parlors. The consensus was nearly universal. The poor widow Miller had finally cracked under the strain of her grief and loneliness. And that wild man she'd saved, he was clearly a wolf she'd invited into her henhouse, a dangerous opportunist, taking advantage of her fragile state. A week after the incident at the gallows, Abigail knew she could no longer avoid a trip into town. Their supplies were running low, and the baby's arrival was a constant, pressing reality. Steeling herself, she hitched their old sway-backed horse Bessie to the small buckboard wagon. Jedediah, having finished repairing the primary wagon's axle with a new piece of seasoned hickory, watched her from the barn door. "I'm going with you," he stated. It was not a request. Abigail hesitated. His presence would only fuel the gossip, but the thought of facing the town's scorn alone was daunting, and the pretense of their marriage required them to be seen together. "All right," she agreed quietly. "But let me do the talking." The ride into town was thick with an unspoken tension. As they drew near, Jedediah felt the familiar weight of hostile eyes. People stopped what they were doing to stare. Doors creaked open, faces peering out from behind curtains. It was a gauntlet of silent judgment. He kept his expression impassive, his gaze straight ahead, but his senses were on high alert. He was back in the place where they had tried to kill him, and he was now the subject of a very different but no less dangerous kind of scrutiny. Their first stop was the general store, owned by a mild-mannered man named Arthur Higgins, Bertha May's husband. As Abigail entered, the low hum of conversation immediately ceased. A few women who had been gathered near the counter quickly dispersed, offering Abigail curt, cold nods as they passed. Bertha May stood behind the counter, her arms crossed over her formidable chest, an expression of sour disapproval etched onto her face. "Abigail," she said, her tone dripping with false pity, "I am so very sorry to see you in such a state." "I am quite well, Bertha May, thank you," Abigail replied coolly, placing her list on the counter. "Are you dear?" Bertha May pressed her voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. It takes a strong constitution to recover from grief, but to take up with a complete stranger of his character. Some might call it reckless. She glanced pointedly toward the door where Jedediah stood, waiting, a silent, imposing figure. "My husband is a good man," Abigail said, her voice firm, refusing to be baited. "Now if I could have 2 sacks of flour, a bag of sugar, and 10 pounds of beans." As Arthur Higgins began to gather the items, Bertha May leaned forward conspiratorially. "I only worry for you, Abigail, and the baby. Sheriff Thorne has been doing some checking. He sent a wire to the marshal in the Northern Territories asking about a man fitting your husband's description. They say a trapper named Stone was wanted for questioning up there. Something about a dispute with another trapper who went missing last winter." The air went cold. Abigail felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. Was it possible? Had she saved a man from the gallows only to discover he was a killer? She risked a glance at Jedediah. His face was a mask of stone, unreadable. She paid for her goods, her hands trembling slightly as she counted out the coins. She held her head high as they left. but the seed of doubt had been planted. Their final stop was the sheriff's office. Thorn was waiting for them, leaning against the doorframe as they approached, whittling a piece of wood with a long, sharp knife. He watched them with a predatory stillness. "Miller," he said, addressing Jedediah directly, ignoring Abigail. "Enjoying your new domestic life?" Jedediah didn't answer, his eyes locked with the sheriff's. Thorn flicked a sliver of wood to the ground and took a step forward, lowering his voice. "I want you to know that I am watching you. I know what you are. You're a leech preying on a vulnerable woman. I don't know what your game is, but it's over. I spoke to Judge Peterson on his circuit. He says that kinship claim is tenuous at best. One mistake, one toe out of line, and I'll have you back on that platform so fast your head will spin. And this time," he added, his voice a low growl, "she won't be able to stop me." He then turned his attention to Abigail, his expression shifting from open hostility to a condescending concern that was somehow more menacing. "Abigail, it is not too late. You can still tell me the truth. Admit this man coerced you, that you were frightened. I can help you. I can see that he is dealt with." The implication was clear. He was offering her a way out, but the price was Jedediah's life. It was in that moment that Abigail's doubt vanished, replaced by a fierce, protective anger. Thorn wasn't interested in justice or her well-being. He was interested in power, in reasserting his authority. He wanted Jedediah gone, and he was trying to use her as his weapon. Whatever secrets Jedediah had, he was her partner in this desperate bargain. She had made her choice at the gallows, and she would not unmake it now. "My husband and I are tired, Sheriff," she said, her voice like ice. "We're going home." She turned and walked to the wagon, leaving Thorn standing there, his face contorted in a mask of frustrated rage. Jedediah followed, and as they rode out of Redemption, Gulch, the silence in the wagon was different. The space between them was no longer filled with suspicion, but with the shared knowledge of the enemies they now faced. The whispers had become threats. The town was not just watching them anymore, it was waiting for them to fail. And Sheriff Thorn was no longer just a humiliated lawman. He was a hunter, patiently waiting for his prey to make a fatal misstep. The farm was no longer just a refuge, it was a fortress under siege. The confrontation with Sheriff Thorn had changed the atmosphere on the farm. The unspoken contract between Jedediah and Abigail was now forged in the heat of shared adversity. The doubt Bertha May had planted in Abigail's mind had been uprooted by Thorn's own malice. She had chosen her side. Jedediah, in turn, felt a deepening sense of responsibility. He was no longer just working for his own survival. He was the guardian of this small, defiant family. His work on the farm took on a new urgency. He toiled from dawn until dusk, his powerful axe swings and steady hands transforming the neglected property. He cleared a new field for spring, planting his knowledge of the land, telling him exactly where the soil was richest. He re-roofed a section of the barn that was threatening to collapse, his movements precise and confident as he navigated the high beams. Abigail found herself watching him more and more. She saw the way he checked the horizon at dawn and dusk, the way he paused in his work to listen to the sounds of the woods. He was a man attuned to the rhythms of a wilder world, and he had brought a piece of that untamed watchfulness to her doorstep. She started leaving a full pitcher of buttermilk with his dinner, a small gesture of gratitude, he acknowledged with a solemn nod. One overcast afternoon, while clearing a stubborn patch of overgrown brush near the property line, Jedediah's shovel struck something hard and metallic. It wasn't a rock. The sound was a dull, hollow thud. His curiosity piqued, he began to dig around the object. A few inches down, he uncovered the rusted corner of a metal strongbox. He worked carefully, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. It was an old army issue box, heavy and solid. The lock was rusted shut, but that was little obstacle for a man who could build a deadfall trap with a few branches and a strip of sinew. He carried the box to the barn, and using a hammer and a cold chisel from Thomas's workbench, he methodically broke the lock. With a final sharp crack, the rusted metal gave way. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside, protected from the damp by a layer of oilcloth, was not gold or valuables, but a collection of papers and a thin, leather-bound ledger. He sat down on a hay bale, the dim light from the barn door illuminating the dusty contents. The first documents were survey maps of the Miller property and the surrounding lands. Tucked among them was a legal deed, but it wasn't for the farm. It was a water rights agreement, signed and sealed, granting exclusive access to the Sweetwater Creek, the only reliable water source in the entire valley, to the Miller farm. The creek ran along the far edge of their land. It was a document of immense value, something that would make the farm the most coveted piece of real estate for miles around. Then he opened the ledger. The first half contained what he expected: neat columns detailing farm expenses, crop yields and profits. Thomas Miller, just as Abigail had described, was a meticulous man. But halfway through, the entries stopped. A few blank pages followed, and then a new section began. The handwriting was the same, but the tone was different, more urgent. This was not a record of accounts. It was a journal. The first entry was dated a month before Thomas's death. October 3rd. Silas Blackwood visited again today. He wants the farm. He does not care about the crops. He wants the water. His Bar B ranch is expanding, and his own wells are running dry. He offered me a price that was insultingly low. When I refused, his smile did not reach his eyes. He said a wise man knows when to sell. Jedediah's blood ran cold. Silas Blackwood was the most powerful man in the territory, a cattle baron whose ranch spanned 3 counties. He was a man known for getting what he wanted, a man who operated far above the simple laws that governed men like Sheriff Thorne, or perhaps not above them at all. He read on his sense of dread growing with each entry. October 12th. Blackwood's foreman, a man named Cole, rode the property line today. He did not wave. He just sat on his horse and watched the creek. I have heard stories about Cole, about the things he does for Blackwood when the law isn't looking. October 25th. Thorne came by. He said there were rumors of rustlers in the area and advised me to be careful. He seemed very interested in my future plans. He asked if I had considered selling. He mentioned Blackwood's name, saying a partnership with him could be very profitable. Is the sheriff in Blackwood's pocket? I fear I am surrounded. The final entry was written the night before Thomas died. The handwriting was shaky. November 5th. I checked the main wagon today. I thought I saw a fresh mark on the axle, but it looked old. My mind is playing tricks. Abigail is so happy about the baby. I must not worry her. I will not be intimidated. This land, this water, it is our future. It is our child's birthright. I will not sell. I will not break. Jedediah closed the ledger, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. It was all there. A motive, a conspiracy, a clear line connecting a wealthy cattle baron, his ruthless foreman, and a corrupt sheriff. Thomas Miller's death was no accident. He had been murdered for his land, and his water executed as surely as Jedediah would have been on the gallows. The scored axle was Blackwood's signature. He looked out from the barn toward the small house, where Abigail was lighting a lamp against the growing dusk. She believed her husband had been taken by a cruel twist of fate. But the truth was so much worse. She was living on a property that powerful men had already killed for, and they surely believed she, a lone, pregnant woman, would be easy to scare away. His own predicament suddenly seemed insignificant. He had been saved from the gallows only to be dropped into the middle of a war he didn't know was being fought. The secret he had unearthed from the soil was more dangerous than any bear or blizzard. It was a truth that could get them both killed. He wrapped the documents and the ledger back in the oilcloth and replaced them in the strongbox. He did not relock it. Instead, he carried the box up to the loft and hid it deep beneath a loose floorboard, burying the evidence under a pile of old hay. When Abigail brought his supper that evening, she noticed the change in him immediately. The quiet watchfulness was gone, replaced by a grim, coiled intensity. "Is something wrong, Jedediah?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked at her at the gentle swell of her belly, at the worry in her eyes, and he made a decision. He could not tell her. Not yet. The knowledge would terrify her, and fear was a luxury they could not afford. He had to protect her, not only from Blackwood and Thorn, but from the terrible truth itself. "No," he lied, his voice a low rumble. "Just a long day. The earth here is hard to turn." Weeks bled into a month. An uneasy truce settled over Redemption Gulch. Jedediah and Abigail were a constant quiet presence, their fabricated marriage accepted by the town as a strange but established fact. Yet beneath the surface, the tension simmered. Sheriff Thorn watched them with an eagle's eye, waiting for a mistake, while Jedediah worked the farm with the grim determination of a man fortifying a stronghold. He was acutely aware that they were living on borrowed time. The first storm of the season arrived without warning, a furious onslaught of wind and rain that turned the dusty farm into a sea of mud. It mirrored the storm brewing in Jedediah's soul. He knew Silas Blackwood would not wait forever. With winter approaching, control of the Sweetwater Creek would be more critical than ever for Blackwood's vast herds. The reckoning came on a grey, wind-swept afternoon. Jedediah was in the barn, reinforcing a wall against the buffeting wind when he saw them. 3 riders materializing out of the rain-swept landscape. They were not lawmen. They were hard-faced men with rifles slung across their saddles. He recognized the man in the lead from Thomas Miller's journal, a thick-shouldered man with a cruel slash of a mouth. It had to be Cole Blackwood's foreman. His first instinct was to grab the old rifle Thomas kept in the barn. But he was one man against 3, and Abigail was alone in the house. A gunfight would be suicide. His mind, honed by years of survival in the wilderness, raced through other options. He was not a gunslinger. He was a trapper, a hunter. He would use his own skills. He slipped out the back of the barn, circling around through the muddy field, using the torrential rain and the low stone wall at the edge of the property as cover. He needed to get to the house to get Abigail somewhere safe. Cole and his men rode directly into the yard and dismounted their boots, sinking into the mud. They didn't bother knocking. Cole kicked the front door of the farmhouse open with a splintering crash. "Mrs. Miller!" He bellowed, his voice a gravelly roar that carried over the wind. "We've come to discuss a business proposition." Inside, Abigail had been by the fire mending a small baby blanket. The violent intrusion sent a shock of pure terror through her. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs, her hand instinctively going to her belly. The 3 men filled the doorway, dripping rainwater onto her clean floor, their presence exuding a brutal menace. "Who are you? What do you want?" she demanded, her voice shaking but defiant. "The name's Cole," the foreman said, stepping inside. He took off his hat, slapping it against his thigh and spraying water across the room. His eyes roamed the small, tidy home with a contemptuous air. "I work for Silas Blackwood. He's a man who believes in being a good neighbor. He knows you're struggling out here all alone. He's prepared to make you a generous offer for this heap of mud you call a farm." "My farm is not for sale," Abigail said, backing away toward the fireplace, her hand reaching for the heavy iron poker. Cole chuckled a low, nasty sound. "Oh, I think it is. Your husband, Thomas, he was stubborn, unreasonable. See, he didn't understand that when Mr. Blackwood wants something, he gets it. It's a shame what happened to him. Accidents can happen so easily out here." The veiled threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. This was it. This was the truth she hadn't let herself see. These men, their sneering faces, their casual cruelty, they had something to do with Thomas's death. Suddenly, the back door of the kitchen flew open. Jedediah stood there drenched, and mud splattered his eyes, burning with a cold, lethal fury. He wasn't holding a rifle. In his hands was the heavy, sharpened axe he used for felling trees. He held it loosely, but it looked as natural and as dangerous in his grip as a pistol in a gunslinger's. Cole and his men startled, spun around their hands, instinctively going to their guns. "You've got no business here." Jedediah said, his voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate with the power of the storm outside. "Get out of this house." Cole's eyes narrowed. "Well, look what we have here. The widow's pet mountain man. I heard about you. You should have kept running, friend." "I'm not your friend," Jedediah said, taking a slow step into the room, placing himself between the men and Abigail. "This is your only warning." One of Cole's men, a lanky youth with nervous eyes, laughed. "He's going to fight the three of us with a wood axe." He started to draw his pistol. What happened next was a blur of savage, calculated motion. Jedediah didn't charge. He lunged to the side, grabbing the heavy wooden table in the center of the kitchen. With a roar of effort, he heaved it over, sending plates and cutlery crashing to the floor. The table slammed into the two henchmen, knocking them off balance and pinning one against the wall. In the same motion, Jedediah moved on Cole, the axe held not as a weapon to swing, but as a shield and a battering ram. He drove the flat of the axe head into Cole's chest, forcing the air from his lungs and sending him staggering backward out the broken front door and into the mud. The lanky youth, free of the table, finally cleared his pistol from its holster. But before he could aim, a heavy iron skillet, thrown by Abigail with all her might, slammed into the side of his head. He crumpled to the floor in a heap. Jedediah was on Cole in the yard, the foreman slipping and sliding in the mud, trying to draw his own weapon. Jedediah kicked the gun from his hand and stood over him, the sharp edge of the axe now resting against Cole's throat. Rain plastered his hair to his head, and his face was a mask of cold rage. "Your mistake wasn't coming here." Jedediah snarled, his voice low and menacing. It was thinking a carefully scored axle would look like an accident to a man who lives with wood. Cole's eyes widened in shock and fear. The bluff, the shot in the dark, had hit its mark. He had just confessed with his eyes. "You tell Blackwood." Jedediah continued pressing the axe, just enough to draw a thin line of blood, that this farm belongs to the Miller family. "You tell him, if he or any of his men ever set foot on this land again, I will not be so merciful. I will hunt them down one by one. You tell him the mountain has come down to the valley and it's protecting its own." He yanked Cole to his feet and shoved him toward his horse. The third man, having untangled himself from the table, scrambled out of the house, his eyes wide with terror. He helped his unconscious partner onto his horse, and the three of them fled, galloping away into the driving rain like panicked deer. Jedediah stood in the mud, the axe still in his hand, watching them go until they were swallowed by the storm. He was breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away. He turned to see Abigail standing in the doorway of her ruined home, her face pale, but her eyes shining with a fierce, newfound strength. The secret was out revealed in a moment of violent clarity. They were no longer a widow and a vagrant in a pretend marriage. They were partners in a fight for their lives. The storm passed, leaving Jedediah and Abigail united by a shared fight. Knowing Blackwood would retaliate, they armed themselves with the truth from Thomas Miller's hidden strongbox, his journal, and the deed to the valuable Sweetwater Creek. They rode into Redemption Gulch and confronted Blackwood and Sheriff Thorne in the saloon before the entire town. In a clear voice, Abigail accused them of murder. Jedediah presented the evidence, the deed as motive, the journal exposing their conspiracy, and his final damning knowledge of the intentionally scored wagon axle that caused the fatal accident. The specific details shattered the villain's composure and convinced the crowd. As other locals bravely spoke out against Blackwood's long-standing tyranny, Sheriff Thorne drew his pistol in a desperate move. Jedediah disarmed him with a well-aimed throw of the heavy box, and the townspeople surged forward to subdue Blackwood, ending his reign of fear. Weeks later, on their peaceful farm porch, Abigail asked what he would do now that his bargain was complete. He took her hand. "My name is Jedediah Miller," he said, his voice full of conviction. "I think I'm already home." And so a story that began under the shadow of the gallows found its end in the warm light of a farmhouse porch. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the most profound acts of courage don't come from a gunslinger's drawer, but from a desperate, defiant heart. A starving man and a pregnant widow, two people with nothing left to lose, rewrote their destinies with a single audacious lie. They stood against corruption and greed, not with bullets, but with the truth of a good man's words and the unyielding strength of their unlikely bond. They proved that even in the harshest corners of the Wild West, justice can find a way and a family can be forged in the most unexpected of fires. What did you think of Abigail's incredible gamble? Was it bravery or madness? Let us know in the comments below. If their story of courage and redemption captured your imagination, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with fellow story lovers, and most importantly, subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to keep bringing these tales from the frontier to life. Thank you for listening.